Everyone feared the millionaire CEO's wife, until a calm waitress turned the tables in front of all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. Madeline Roberts was not a woman you'd forget easily. She carried herself with an aura of power, her presence alone commanding respect from everyone in the room. As the wife of Richard Roberts, the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country, she was used to people looking up to her, literally and figuratively. Madeline's poised figure and sharp, calculating eyes made her the epitome of confidence and authority. The moment she walked into a room, the chatter died down, and people straightened their backs. Her reputation preceded her, and it wasn't just because of her husband's fortune. Madeline had a way of making people feel small, even if they were powerful in their own right. At the lavish company dinner, where industry leaders, investors, and celebrities mingled, Madeline was the center of attention. The men admired her beauty, while the women secretly feared her, knowing that she had the ability to undermine anyone who posed a threat to her position. But the night wasn't going as she expected. Richard had arranged a dinner with some important clients, and as usual, Madeline played the role of the gracious hostess. However, there was one person in the room who didn't seem to be impressed by her at all. Emily Johnson was a calm, composed waitress, completely unruffled by the extravagant surroundings. She had seen it all before, the sharp-tongued CEOs, the wealthy investors throwing their weight around. Emily had worked her fair share of high-end events, but she never let the glitter and glamour of it all get to her. As she moved through the room, serving drinks and appetizers, her eyes occasionally flicked to Madeline. She could feel the tension radiating from the woman. Madeline was used to being the one in control, but Emily had no intention of letting her take charge of this evening. Emily wasn't intimidated. She had seen more than her fair share of power struggles, but none like the one she was witnessing tonight. Madeline, with her ice-cold stare, was used to getting her way. But there was something about Emily that Madeline didn't expect. She wasn't afraid to speak up when she saw something wrong. Madeline's voice rose, cutting through the chatter. "Waitress, this wine is unacceptable. It's warm." Her words were sharp, and the room fell silent as she waited for Emily to react. But Emily didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her expression neutral. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll have it replaced immediately," she replied calmly, her voice steady. But as she turned to leave, Emily caught a glimpse of the expression on Madeline's face. It wasn't just frustration, it was anger. Emily knew that Madeline wouldn't let this go so easily. The night went on, but the tension between them lingered in the air. Madeline's every word, every glance, was calculated to put everyone in their place. Yet, when it came time to serve dessert, it was Emily who noticed something that no one else did. Madeline, as usual, was trying to make herself the focal point of the conversation. She was speaking to the CEO of one of the largest companies in the room, her voice dripping with sweetness, but Emily overheard a small detail that made her pause. Madeline had made a slight miscalculation in her speech, mispronouncing an important name. The moment was brief, but it was enough. Emily moved forward, confidently. "Excuse me, Mrs. Roberts," she said, her voice calm yet firm. Madeline turned, surprised by Emily's sudden interruption. "You've mentioned the wrong company name," Emily continued, her tone smooth. "The CEO you're referring to is from LGT Industries, not East Tech." The room fell silent. Madeline's perfect composure faltered for a split second, and everyone in the room turned to watch. The billionaire CEOs, the investors, all eyes were on Emily. Madeline's sharp gaze narrowed, her lips parting in disbelief. She wasn't used to being corrected, especially not in front of such an influential crowd. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The power she had so carefully cultivated suddenly felt fragile. And then, Emily smiled. She didn't gloat. She didn't say another word. She simply left the table, allowing the room to process what had just happened. The evening had shifted, and it was Madeline who now felt like she was no longer in control. The silence in the room was deafening. Madeline Roberts, the woman who had always held the power to control any situation, stood frozen. Her confident demeanor, which had always kept everyone at bay, now seemed like an illusion, shattered by one simple mistake. She had been publicly corrected by Emily, a calm, quiet waitress who had no reason to fear the billionaire wife. The change was subtle but undeniable. The eyes of the room were no longer on Madeline, but on Emily. And for the first time, Madeline felt something she hadn't in years: vulnerability. Emily, on the other hand, remained calm, unaffected by the storm she had just created. She continued her work, gliding through the room, but her mind was still on the moment she had just sparked. She had no intention of putting Madeline in her place. She was simply doing what she knew was right. The evening continued, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. Madeline, who was used to being the center of attention, now found herself surrounded by whispers. It wasn't long before Richard Roberts, her husband, noticed the change. He had been deep in conversation with a potential investor, but his eyes kept drifting towards Emily. Something about the way she handled the situation intrigued him. He had always known his wife to be the powerful one, the one with all the answers. But now he wasn't so sure. Richard had always been a man of control, a man who calculated every move, every word. But now, for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure who was running the show. Emily's casual grace, her confidence, her ability to remain unaffected by the power struggles around her. It was all so different from what he was used to. He watched as she moved, effortlessly charming guests, and as he observed her, something in his mind clicked. He had spent years building his empire, never once stopping to question the way the world worked around him. He had always believed that money, power, and influence were the ultimate tools of control. But here, in this moment, he realized that there was something more powerful than all of those things combined. Emily was that something. Meanwhile, Madeline tried to regain control of the evening, but the more she attempted to assert her dominance, the more she realized that she was no longer the one in charge. The respect she once commanded seemed to dissipate with every passing minute. The guests were no longer hanging on her every word. They were watching Emily. She could feel it. Madeline's sharp gaze flicked to her husband, who had been watching Emily with an odd expression on his face. For a brief moment, Madeline's heart sank. She wasn't used to seeing her husband so fascinated by anyone, especially not someone like Emily. Emily wasn't part of their world. She wasn't a socialite, a business mogul, or someone from the right circles. She was a waitress, someone Madeline had likely overlooked her entire life. And yet, here she was, commanding more attention than anyone else in the room. The feeling was unsettling. As the evening wound down, Emily caught a glimpse of Madeline in the corner of her eye. Madeline was standing with Richard, her face a picture of forced calm, but Emily could tell that the moment had affected her more than she was letting on. Emily couldn't help but smile to herself. She wasn't trying to embarrass Madeline. She was just doing her job. But sometimes, that was all it took to reveal the truth. As the last guest left, Richard found himself lingering by the door, waiting for Emily. When she finally approached, he looked at her with newfound curiosity. "You handled that well," he said, his tone softer than usual. Emily glanced up, meeting his gaze for a moment before lowering her eyes. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job," she replied, her voice steady. But inside, Emily felt a rush of emotions. She hadn't expected to change the dynamic of the evening. She hadn't expected to turn the tables. But in that moment, she knew that the world she had been serving for so long, the world of power, money, and influence, was not as unshakable as everyone thought. And just for a brief moment, Emily felt like she had the power to change it. The next few days were a whirlwind for Emily. The dinner with the CEOs and investors was supposed to be just another night at work, but it had turned into something much more than that. Everywhere she went, she could feel the shift in the air. People looked at her differently. Whispers followed her wherever she moved. It was as though, for the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. Madeline, on the other hand, had retreated into herself. The icy confidence she once wore like armor had cracked, and she was no longer the undisputed queen of the room. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with a new kind of respect, one that had nothing to do with her wealth, her beauty, or her influence. It was respect for someone who had done something extraordinary. Madeline could feel the change. It was like a weight on her chest, a pressure that she couldn't shake. She tried to ignore it, but it followed her everywhere, especially when she found herself in Richard's presence. Her husband, the man who had always been captivated by her, now seemed distant. She could see it in the way he looked at her, or more accurately, the way he no longer looked at her the same way. It was as if the admiration that once radiated from him had been replaced by something else. A curiosity, perhaps. A doubt. Madeline knew that the night of the dinner had been a turning point, but she wasn't sure how to navigate it. She tried to regain control, to put herself back in the center of their world. But it wasn't as easy as she had thought. Richard had begun to spend more time at the office, and Madeline was left alone in the mansion, surrounded by luxury, but feeling emptier than she ever had before. Meanwhile, Emily's world was changing too. The respect she had earned from that one moment of quiet courage had opened new doors for her. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. People saw her as someone with depth, someone who had a voice that deserved to be heard. One evening, as she finished her shift at the restaurant, she was surprised to find Richard waiting by the door. His presence caught her off guard, but there was something in his eyes, something different from the usual indifference he had shown her. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. "Can we talk?" She nodded, still unsure of what was happening. He led her to a quiet corner of the restaurant, away from the noise of the kitchen and the chatter of the remaining guests. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for what you did at the dinner. It was impressive." Emily was taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. She had never expected this moment, and she certainly hadn't expected it from Richard. "I just did what I thought was right," she replied, her voice steady. "I didn't mean to cause a scene." "No," Richard said quickly. "It wasn't a scene. It was exactly what needed to happen. You showed me something that night, Emily. Something I've been missing." Emily looked at him, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, this world of business and power," Richard said, his gaze distant. "But I've lost sight of something important. I've lost sight of what really matters." He looked at her, his expression vulnerable. "You reminded me of that. You reminded me that there's more to life than just money and influence. There's integrity. There's honesty. There's real power in people who don't play the game the way I do." Emily felt a flicker of surprise, but she kept her composure. "I'm just a waitress," she said softly. "I'm not in your world." Richard smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You're in a different world, yes. But that doesn't make it any less valuable. In fact, it makes it more valuable." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure how to respond. She had never thought of herself as anything other than what she was, a waitress, someone who served people, someone who stayed out of the spotlight. But now, for the first time, she was beginning to see herself differently. "I need your help," Richard said suddenly, snapping Emily out of her thoughts. "I've been looking at the way I've been running my business. I've been too focused on the wrong things. I need someone who can help me see the bigger picture. Someone who's not afraid to challenge me." Emily's heart began to race. "What are you asking me to do?" she asked cautiously. Richard leaned in, his eyes intense. "I'm asking you to come work with me. As a consultant. I need your perspective. Your insight." Emily's mind whirled. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that someone like Richard Roberts, a billionaire CEO, would ever seek her opinion, let alone offer her a job. But, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her pause. It wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a chance to make a real difference. To change the world in a way she never thought possible. Emily had never been the type to get ahead of herself. The offer Richard had made was overwhelming, yet somehow, it felt right. As she walked out of the restaurant that evening, her mind raced. The thought of working alongside Richard, a billionaire CEO, was something she had never imagined for herself. She had always been just a waitress, a person who served others. But now, for the first time, she realized she had the power to influence, to make a difference in a world she had always felt separate from. The next day, Emily found herself standing outside the towering glass building that housed Anderson Capital. She had never been in a place like this before, and the weight of it all seemed to press down on her shoulders. The polished floors, the sharp-suited employees walking briskly through the halls, it was all so different from the quiet, modest world she had known. She was given a visitor's pass and led to a sleek, modern conference room. Richard was already there, waiting for her with a warm smile that made her feel, for the first time, that she truly belonged. "Welcome to Anderson Capital," he said, rising from behind the desk to greet her. His voice was steady, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. I'm glad you're here, Emily. She took a seat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, though. Richard smiled again, his gaze softening. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't believe you were. You showed me something that night, something I haven't seen in a long time. You have a perspective I need, and I trust you to help me see things differently. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that were threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent so long feeling small, insignificant in a world that valued power and wealth above all else. But now, here she was, sitting across from a man who, in a strange way, had made her feel like she had something important to offer. The day passed in a blur of meetings, numbers, and strategies. Emily quickly realized that her knowledge of finance wasn't as lacking as she had thought. She wasn't just some waitress with a good memory. She had insights, ideas that had been overlooked by those who had been in the business world far longer than she had. Richard watched her closely, impressed by how quickly she grasped the complexities of the projects they were working on. He had underestimated her, he admitted to himself. She wasn't just a waitress, not anymore. As the week went on, Emily began to feel more comfortable in her new role. She was given responsibilities, asked for her opinions on investment strategies, and treated with a level of respect that she had never experienced before. The people around her, the same ones who had once ignored her or looked down on her, now listened to her carefully. Emily wasn't just the girl who served drinks anymore. She was someone who mattered. But with the growing respect came growing tension. Madeline, Richard's wife, had noticed the change too. She had always been the one to hold the reins, to make sure everything and everyone in her world knew their place. But now, as she watched Richard give Emily more and more attention, she felt something shift in the balance of power. Madeline had always been in control, the one who made the decisions, who held the influence. But now, she found herself questioning her place in Richard's life. It wasn't just the business, though. It was the way Richard was looking at Emily. The way he listened to her, valued her opinion. Madeline didn't like it. She didn't like it at all. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner meeting, Madeline approached Emily. Her usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by something colder. You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine? Madeline's voice was low, sharp. You think you can just take over everything my husband built? Emily met her gaze, unflinching. She wasn't intimidated anymore. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Emily said, her voice steady. I'm just doing my job. Richard asked for my help, and I'm giving it. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but I'm not going anywhere. Madeline's eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned and walked away, the weight of her anger filling the room. Emily stood there for a moment, her pulse racing. She had just stood up to Madeline Roberts, the woman everyone feared. And she hadn't backed down. For the first time in her life, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But she knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The world of power, money, and influence wasn't one that gave up its control easily. And Madeline would not let Emily steal her spotlight without a fight. The tension between Emily and Madeline had become palpable. It was as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of their rivalry, an unspoken war being fought under the polished surface of the company's boardrooms and dinners. Emily, who had once been content with serving drinks and taking orders, now found herself in a world where every move she made was scrutinized, every word she spoke weighed. But this time, she wasn't the one in the background. She had a voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. As the days passed, Emily's influence within Anderson Capital grew. She was no longer just Richard's consultant. She was a valuable asset to the company. Her insights, sharp and fresh, challenged the traditional thinking that had dominated the firm for years. The executives, who had once looked at her with skepticism, now sought her opinion on key decisions. Richard was impressed by her ability to cut through the noise, to focus on what really mattered. He found himself relying on her more and more, valuing her perspective above all others. But Madeline, the queen of their world, was not one to relinquish her power without a fight. It wasn't long before she started making her moves. At a gala one evening, Madeline made sure to pull Richard aside, her voice low and urgent. You're making a mistake, she whispered. Her eyes narrowed in a way that made Richard's heart tighten. She's using you, Richard. Don't you see it? She's taking your place. Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always trusted Madeline, always believed in her. But now, something was different. Her words, once so easy to dismiss, now lingered in his mind. He found himself questioning the decision to bring Emily into his world. You don't understand, Madeline, Richard replied, his voice hesitant. She's more than just a waitress. She has something I need, something I've been missing. Madeline's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. And what's that? Her ability to make you feel like you matter? You've always mattered, Richard. You don't need her to tell you what to do. Richard looked away, torn. He had always been the one to make the decisions, to hold the reins. But now, it was Emily who seemed to have a grip on things that he couldn't deny. Madeline's words stung, but Emily's calm demeanor, her ability to cut through the chaos, had made him realize something about himself. Maybe he had lost his way somewhere along the line. But Madeline wasn't done. She would never let go of her influence without a fight. The next day, she made sure to make her presence known. She invited Richard to lunch, and during the meal, she subtly reminded him of all the things they had built together. You and I, Richard, we've created something great, she said, her eyes locking onto his. But she's not part of that world. You can't let her change it. Richard looked at Madeline, the woman who had been by his side for years, who had supported him through thick and thin. He felt the pull of her words, but deep down, he knew that something had shifted. He could feel it every time Emily spoke, every time she walked into a room with her quiet confidence. She had awakened something in him, something that Madeline could never give him. The decision was hard, but Richard knew it had to be made. The next time he saw Emily, he made sure to thank her for everything she had done for the company. But there was more he needed to say. I've been thinking, he started, his voice steady. I want to make you a permanent part of the team, not just as a consultant, but as someone who helps shape the future of Anderson Capital. Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. I appreciate that, Richard, she said, her voice calm. But I'm not here to take your place. I'm here to help. Richard nodded, understanding her words. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Emily had shown him that there was more to life than power and money. There was something more meaningful, something worth fighting for. And as for Madeline, she was still by his side, but Richard knew that their world was changing. The balance of power had shifted, and it wasn't something either of them could control. It was a new chapter, and for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was ready to face it, with Emily by his side. The days that followed were filled with change. Emily had slowly but surely carved out a place for herself within Anderson Capital. Her ideas were no longer just welcomed, they were sought after. Richard began to rely on her insights, using her perspective to shape the company's direction. The board meetings, once filled with heated debates and traditional viewpoints, now saw fresh angles, thanks to Emily. But not everyone was pleased with this shift. Madeline, who had been used to being the central figure in Richard's life and career, found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable. She watched, from the sidelines, as Emily's influence expanded. It wasn't just in the office. Emily was invited to more and more events, sitting alongside Richard, the two of them discussing strategies, investments, and company futures. Madeline, who had always been the epitome of elegance and control, couldn't help but feel threatened. The tension between the two women simmered beneath the surface. Emily, ever calm and composed, never directly challenged Madeline. She didn't need to. Her quiet confidence and intelligence were enough. But Madeline couldn't ignore it. At a charity gala one evening, as the room buzzed with conversation and laughter, Madeline found herself alone in a corner, nursing a glass of champagne. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing something vital. Richard, always at her side at these events, had spent the entire evening deep in conversation with Emily, his attention fixed on her words. Madeline felt her stomach tighten. She had once been the one to captivate Richard's attention, to make him listen. But now, it was Emily who held that power. As the night wore on, Madeline finally approached them. Emily noticed her before Richard did, her eyes flicking to Madeline's direction. There was no malice in her gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement. Richard turned to face Madeline, his expression softening when he saw her. Madeline, everything. Okay, he asked. Madeline forced a smile, her grip tightening around her glass. Of course, she replied coolly. I just wanted to make sure you weren't too busy to talk to your wife. The words were sharp, but she said them with a sweetness that made them even more cutting. Richard didn't seem to catch the underlying tension. He smiled, his eyes flicking between the two women. Madeline, Emily's been helping me a lot lately. I don't think I've told you how much her input has shaped some of our latest decisions. The way Richard spoke about Emily, with such genuine admiration, caused a flicker of unease in Madeline's chest. She had never been threatened by anyone before. She had always been the one in control. But now, she realized that Emily was someone she couldn't easily dismiss. I can see that, Madeline said, her voice laced with a coldness she couldn't quite hide. But don't forget, Richard, I've been here all along. I've been by your side through everything, not just in business, but in life. Richard's expression faltered for a moment, and Emily, sensing the tension, stepped back slightly. I know, Madeline, he said softly. You've always been by my side. I'm not forgetting that. But there's something different about Emily. She sees things I don't, and that's why I value her perspective. Madeline's smile remained, but there was a sharpness to it now. I see, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, I hope you're not forgetting who really built this empire. She turned, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked away, leaving Richard and Emily standing in an uncomfortable silence. Richard watched his wife retreat, a mixture of guilt and confusion clouding his mind. He knew he needed to talk to Madeline, to reassure her that nothing had changed between them. But deep down, he couldn't deny the truth of his words. Emily had brought something to the table that he hadn't realized he needed. Emily, on the other hand, didn't look at him for reassurance. She simply stood there, calm and composed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't here to be a threat. She wasn't here to take anyone's place. She was here to help. And if that made people uncomfortable, then so be it. She wasn't going to apologize for her success. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Richard continued to turn to Emily for advice, and Madeline continued to struggle with the growing distance between them. The tension between the two women remained, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. Emily could feel it, but she didn't let it affect her. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it well. She wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Madeline, make her second-guess her place in this new world. The weeks passed, and the subtle war between Emily and Madeline continued, though it was never openly acknowledged. It was an unspoken tension that lingered in the air, thickening with every passing day. Richard, who had always been the glue holding the pieces of his world together, found himself caught in the middle. He was drawn to Emily's clear vision, her fresh perspective, and the calm authority she exuded. At the same time, he knew he couldn't ignore the decades of history with Madeline. She was still the mother of his children, his partner in the empire he had built. Yet, Emily had begun to fill a role that Madeline had once occupied without question. She was now the one who offered him clarity in moments of doubt, the one who could see through the complexities of the business world in ways he couldn't. One afternoon, Richard called Emily into his office, her presence now an integral part of his daily routine. She walked in with the same calm confidence that had become her trademark, her steps steady, her posture unshaken. I've been thinking, Richard began, his voice hesitant. You've done a lot for this company, Emily. More than I ever expected. Emily gave him a small nod, her eyes calm but focused. I'm just doing what I can, Richard. I've never wanted anything more than to help. I know, he said quietly, but I think it's time we take this further. I need you to step into a larger role. I want you to help lead the next phase of our growth. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected such a direct offer, and for a moment, she struggled to find the words. But then she remembered what she had learned during her time working alongside Richard. This was her moment. I'm honored, Richard, she said, her voice steady. But I need to make one thing clear. I'm not trying to take over anything. I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm here to help build something better. Richard smiled, a mix of admiration and relief in his eyes. I never thought you were, he replied, his tone sincere. That's exactly why I trust you. Meanwhile, Madeline, still reeling from the slow shift in the power dynamics within her home and the company, had been watching the developments with a growing sense of unease. She could feel Richard pulling away, not just emotionally, but professionally. She saw it in the way he increasingly turned to Emily for guidance, in the way their conversations seemed to last longer than the ones he had with her. Madeline wasn't blind to the changes. She knew something had shifted, but she couldn't quite figure out how to stop it. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Madeline waited for Richard in their lavish living room. When he walked in, she didn't greet him with her usual smile. Instead, her gaze was sharp, her posture stiff. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge. Richard looked up, surprised by the sudden tension in her tone. "About what?" "About Emily," she said, the words coming out colder than she intended. "You've been spending a lot of time with her." "Too much time." Richard hesitated, not quite sure how to respond. "Madeline, she's just what?" Madeline interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "She's not just anything. She's a threat. To us, to everything we've built." Richard's expression hardened. He had known this conversation was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "She's not a threat, Madeline," he said quietly, his voice firm. "She's part of the team now, and she's helping us grow. I don't know why you can't see that." Madeline stood, her face flushed with frustration. "Because I built this team, Richard, not her. You owe me more than this. I've been with you through everything. And now you're handing her the keys to everything we've worked for." Richard's heart tightened at her words, but he stood his ground. "You don't understand, Madeline. Emily has vision. She's shown me things I didn't see before. I can't ignore that. I won't ignore that." There was a long silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Madeline turned away, fighting the sting of betrayal that welled up. Inside her, she had always been the one in control, the one who held the power, but now it seemed like that power was slipping away. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep fighting this battle." Richard reached out to her, but Madeline pulled away, her shoulders tense. "It's not about fighting anymore, Madeline," he said softly. "It's about moving forward. I need to do this, with or without you." Madeline's eyes flashed with anger, but there was also a deep sadness in them. She knew this moment was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. "Then go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go and build your empire with her. But know this, once you do, there's no coming back." Richard watched her for a long moment, torn between the woman he had once loved and the new future he was trying to build. He didn't want to leave her, but he knew he had already made the choice. Emily had opened his eyes to a different path, one that didn't involve constant control and manipulation. It was a path that would require him to trust, to let go. And, for the first time in his life, Richard realized he was ready to do just that. The weeks that followed Richard's decision were filled with an unsettling stillness. It was as though the world around him had shifted, but he was unsure whether it was for the better or worse. Emily's presence within the company had grown stronger, her influence undeniable. She was becoming more than just a consultant. She was shaping the future of Anderson Capital in ways Richard hadn't imagined. The executives who once dismissed her were now seeking her opinion, and even Richard, who had been initially hesitant to give up control, was now relying on her expertise to guide the company through uncertain waters. But Madeline's departure, while inevitable, left a void that was difficult to fill. Richard had never expected things to fall apart so quickly. Their years of marriage, of shared dreams and struggles, had come to an abrupt halt, and now he was forced to navigate a new reality. Emily, ever the steady force, was there for him, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't the person he had built this empire with. Yet, in many ways, she had become more essential to him than Madeline ever had been. The change was subtle, but Richard could feel it every day. When he looked at Emily, he saw someone who had proven herself in a world he had long dominated. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't afraid of his wealth or power. She saw the world with a clarity he had lost somewhere along the way. And that made her invaluable. But it also made things complicated. Richard found himself questioning his own motives. Was he hiring Emily because of her talents, or because he had begun to rely on her in ways that went beyond business? As time passed, the line between professional and personal began to blur, and Richard found himself struggling to separate the two. Emily, on the other hand, was as calm and composed as ever. She had never sought out power or attention. She had always just wanted to help, to be a part of something that meant more than just profits and losses. But she could feel the weight of the changes too. The way Richard looked at her sometimes, the way he leaned in just a little too close during meetings. It made her wonder if he was seeing her as more than just an advisor. She had always kept her emotions in check, especially when it came to Richard. She had no intention of complicating their professional relationship. But as she spent more time with him, she began to realize how deeply she had come to respect him. He was driven, intelligent, and in many ways, he reminded her of the person she had been before she stepped into this world of power and corporate battles. The respect she had for him was undeniable, but she couldn't let herself get too attached. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to jeopardize that for anything. One evening, Richard asked Emily to join him for a private dinner at the office. It wasn't uncommon for them to discuss business over meals, but this felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, and as they sat across from each other, Richard's gaze lingered on her longer than usual. "You've done more for this company than I ever expected," he said, his voice low. "More than anyone could have imagined." Emily looked up at him, her expression neutral, but inside, her heart fluttered slightly. She had never heard him speak like that before. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to keep the conversation on track. But Richard didn't seem to want to let it go. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You've done more than that. You've changed everything. And I don't know how to thank you for that." Emily swallowed, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I'm just doing what I can to help," she said again, her voice steady. Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "I know, but there's more I need to say. Emily, I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening, about us, about everything." Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a pang of unease. This was no longer about business. "Richard," she began, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "Let me finish," he said quietly. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I started looking at you differently. And I need to know if you feel the same way." Emily froze, her mind racing. She had expected many things from Richard, but not this. She had worked hard to keep their relationship professional, to avoid any personal entanglements. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the lines had blurred. She wasn't sure what to say. Was this a business decision, or was there something else? She had always kept her emotions in check, but this was different. Richard wasn't just her boss anymore. He was someone she had come to respect, admire, and perhaps even care for. But she couldn't let that cloud her judgment. She had made it this far on her own, without anyone's help. And she wasn't about to let her feelings complicate things now. "I think we should keep our focus on the company," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected her response. "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't want to make this awkward, Emily. But I had to ask." The silence between them hung heavy, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. Emily looked at him, then glanced away, her mind still spinning. She had made her decision, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next few days felt like a delicate balancing act for Emily. She had made her stance clear with Richard. She wasn't going to let anything blur the lines between their professional relationship. But the weight of her decision pressed down on her. Every time she saw Richard, she couldn't help but feel that there was something more between them, something that went beyond the business. But she kept telling herself that her role was clear. She was here to help, not to complicate things. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to have accepted her decision, though his quiet glances and the way he lingered a little longer after meetings made her question if he truly had. The dynamic between them was shifting, and Emily could feel it every time they spoke. One afternoon, Richard called her into his office once again. Emily walked in, trying to keep her expression neutral, but she could sense the unease in the air. Richard was standing by the window, staring out at the skyline. When he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "Emily," he began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. "What's on your mind?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. "It's about the company," Richard said, walking towards her. "You've done incredible things for Anderson Capital. You've made it better, sharper. But I can't help but feel like we're at a crossroads here." Emily looked at him, her mind racing. "A crossroads?" she repeated, her voice calm. "Yes," Richard said, his eyes locking with hers. "I've been thinking about the future. I want to take this company to places we've never been before. But I need someone by my side who can help me see things clearly, someone I can trust. The words hung in the air, and Emily knew this wasn't just about business anymore. I thought that's what I've been doing, she said, her voice steady but with a trace of confusion. Richard's gaze softened. You have. But it's more than that now. I need someone who can challenge me, someone who isn't afraid to push back when I'm wrong. Emily felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused and professional. But now, Richard was asking her to be more than just a colleague. He was asking her to be a partner in something bigger, something more personal. And what does that mean for us? She asked carefully, trying to keep her emotions in check. Richard paused, his expression shifting to something more vulnerable. It means I'm offering you more than just a job, he said quietly. I'm offering you a partnership. In every sense of the word. The words hit Emily like a ton of bricks. She had never imagined this moment would come. She had worked so hard to build her place in this world, to prove that she was more than just a waitress, more than just someone who helped the powerful. But now, Richard was offering her something that felt more like a dream than a reality. I can't just accept this without thinking it through, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need time to figure out what this means for me. Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. I get it. Take all the time you need. But know that I believe in you, Emily. I believe in what you bring to this company and to me. Emily stood there for a moment, her heart racing, her mind filled with 1,000 thoughts. She had come so far, but now she had to decide if she was willing to risk everything to take the next step. She had always been driven by her desire to succeed, to make a difference. But now, she was faced with the possibility of something more, something that could change her life forever. As she left Richard's office, Emily couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had made her decision to help him, to guide the company into uncharted waters. But now, the question was whether she was ready to step into the unknown with him, both professionally and personally. The line between work and life had already blurred, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest challenge was still ahead.